What's going on, guys? Welcome back to our F1 team previews here as we near the beginning of the 2026 season. Preseason testing is just around the corner, and we only have a handful of teams remaining. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at Williams, Ferrari, and Red Bull as we near ever more towards the beginning of 2026. I'm getting more and more excited, and we're getting closer and closer to talking about some teams who are going to be potentially fighting for the F1 World Championship. In this one, we're going to be talking about those three teams I just mentioned. We're going to be going over a handful of things, the same things we've been talking about in previews past. We're going to be talking, driver lineups, dynamics, biggest concerns, biggest upsides, storylines that we're going to follow across the season, and we're going to talk about what we expect from these teams as we get to 2026. We're going to go ahead and get things kicked off with Williams. So, hey, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on onto this thing. All right, let's go ahead, kick things off with Williams F1 team, who finished fifth in the Constructors last season after a very strong year for the team and strong half years for each of their drivers individually. It was a very, very good year for Williams. You had Alex Albon at the beginning of the season fighting for top fives consistently, and they ended the year with Carlos Sainz lodging a couple of podiums down the stretch. And so it is going to get very interesting for them going forward to see if they can continue the momentum and try and continue to make up ground on those ahead in the Constructors. If things go well, like a lot of us are expecting it to, although there's some iffy news going on right now around whether or not they're going to make the Barcelona preseason, pre-TEF1 testing shakedown, it's going to get fun to follow, I think, with Williams, who have obviously continued to take steps forward with James Vowles at the head. So, going to be very fun to follow. And in terms of overall team direction, I do think right now they are probably the most consistent midfield team that you could ask for. They are very quickly nearing the that sort of best of the rest, if not consistently or cementing themselves there as of right now, based on the 2025 results. They have a driver lineup to make it happen, and while they're not potentially not really a contender as of now, Carlos Sainz has shown that that car and that team have what it takes to put it on the podium, and so it'll be very, very interesting to follow, to say the least. I'm going to try and say the word interesting a lot less this week. I think I remember while I was editing last week's video, I said interesting probably about 1,000 times. So we're going to try and find some more synonyms. But let's go ahead and kick things off with our driver lineup and dynamics. Their driver lineup, as mentioned by me just a moment ago, is Alex Albon, who has been with the team for quite a few years at this point, and Carlos Sainz, who just finished up his first season with Williams after leaving Ferrari at the end of the 2024 season. In terms of experience versus youth, I think there are two very experienced drivers behind the wheel. One of those teams that are leaning on definitely a couple of drivers who have lodged a lot of laps and a lot of Grand Prix under their belts. They definitely are. I think they also get a little bit of a benefit from youth as well. Neither driver is particularly old, to say the least. And so if they can, manage to make these drivers happy, I think they have a pretty solid driver lineup that could last a long time, especially if they continue to put cars on track that compete at the level they did in 2025. So in terms of a clear number one or number two driver, I think this one actually is a pretty open competition. I think a lot of people at the beginning of 2025 were talking about what Carlos Sainz coming into the team would do for Alex Albon, who had very clearly taken the number one spot while he was driving with, drivers like Nicholas Latifi, Logan Sargent, and people like that. And so it is very curious to see how this actually shakes out, I think, in year two. In the beginning of 2025, I think you would still say that Alex was clearly leading the team, with Carlos struggling to get up to pace. But as 2025 came to a close, it was Carlos who was putting in the really good results, and Alex had realistically started to struggle from about the midpoint on. So I think it is a pretty definition of an open competition for the number one or number two driver, and it might be a very McLaren-esque situation that we saw in 2025, where there is no true clear number one. I think it is just kind of going to be, who has what it takes in that particular weekend. So it'll be fun to follow that for sure. And then in terms of internal dynamics or pressure points, I think the internal performance battles between Carlos and Alex could potentially bubble up to add a bit of pressure on the team to, deliver across the entire organization. Before, when it was Alex and other drivers who struggled, to say the least, I think it was pretty clear that they were putting a lot of their eggs in the Alex Albon basket. But it'll be very much a case of, like I mentioned, I think it'll be who is doing well, either in that weekend or in this stretch, that is going to cause a lot of pressure to be put on the both the strategy and the pit wall, to say the least. And in terms of who is expected to lead development, I think this is very clearly another team with both drivers going to be leading the development of these cars. Obviously, both have been involved in high level teams in the past and have a lot of experience in continuing to develop cars. So they'll probably share responsibilities, if I say so myself. All right, let's go ahead and transition now to our biggest question heading into 2026 for Williams. And I think the biggest unknown for this team is that can Williams continue to take those steps forward? We saw from the beginning of this recent ground effects regulation where they were at points very clearly at the back, and they ended that run with a very clear best of the rest, top of that midfield pack, pretty far and away compared to the other teams on the grid. And so, can they continue to roll that momentum? The inklings that we're having is that they should have a relatively strong platform with the Mercedes engine, but at the same time, there's all of these rumors and things going around with what could be going on with their potential impact to not making the Barcelona shakedown. They are at this point, I believe, not they're electing to not go and make any of the days, and so that is one of those situations where you can read into it as much or as little. The reality is that we're not going to get to know anything about it, and so that could be one of the really big unknowns. They should have a platform and a team to deliver once again. But if they are behind in development and getting ready for the season, that could really spell disaster for them should things go wrong here in 2026. So it definitely, this actually point changed a little bit with the announcement that they were going to miss the Barcelona shakedown, because I think it's something for me personally, my opinion is I think something would have to be seriously wrong for a team to elect to miss a full week of running basically for these new cars. So I hope that I'm wrong and I hope they have something figured out, but at the same time, to miss a full week of shakedown tests is definitely a bit of a concern more than a bonus when it comes to me. And in terms of what must go right for success, my original point was that Alex and Carlos start performing together rather than one at a time. I mentioned before in 2025 it was a tale of two halves of the season for Alex and Carlos respectively. If they can come in and be very on pace together, I think it'll only bode well for Williams. Obviously, both drivers have shown the propensity and the skill and pace to consistently score really high points, and number of points every weekend. And so in terms of what must go right, I think I'll add on a little combination of they have to get a car on track that, is going to be able to perform, and then at the same time have Carlos and Alex start to perform jointly together. As we move forward towards biggest concern for Williams, I think my original point for primary risk entering the season was that they weren't going to be able to get the most out of the Mercedes engine. But I think my new biggest risk going into the season is not having an understanding of their platform to the point where they can start development on the right foot. I can only read into the missing of the Barcelona shakedown as much as I can imagine. And if it is truly just they're either behind in manufacturing or in development or an understanding of their foundation, I think that only bodes worse for them as the season gets nearer and nearer. And so their primary risk entering the season is actually the same as my most likely failure point if things go wrong. And that is a lack of understanding, or the foundation of car development is behind. They should have the benefit of having the Mercedes engine, but if they are truly that far behind in development terms, I think that is going to hold them back more so than the engine would prop them up. So I'm not sure. Now, it can't all be doom and gloom as we take a look at their biggest upside for 2026. And I think the key strength or advantage is that there is a lot of potential in both their team principal and driver lineup combinations. Obviously, you have a lot of experience in Formula One with Alex and Carlos, a lot of experience in being in a successful team like James Vowles while he spent his time at Mercedes. And he has shown an ability to take a team and help them take a step forward in Williams. I think if anyone is going to be able to figure it out, he is definitely on the list to do so. I think a lot of people, including myself, are going to get really bogged down with this, missing the shakedown test in Barcelona and kind of apply too many negative things. Obviously, I think it'll probably end up somewhere in the middle. I'm going to operate under the assumption that they'll get it figured out in a couple by the time that, actual preseason testing rolls around. And all of these teams are going to be going through things like this. It just, Williams might be, just a step slow compared to other teams. But in reality, they have a very strong driver lineup. They have a very strong team principal, in my opinion. And I think it's only going to help them in 2026. And in terms of best case performance ceiling, I think it'll be somewhere around like what we saw in 2025, where if they can get the most out of the engine and have a good handle on the foundation of their car, I think they can be consistent point scorers with, as we've seen, the occasional fight for podiums. If they go to a track and get a setup right and a track that suits them well, I think it can only bode well for them in the future. So I think it is definitely a case of potentially low floor or high ceiling at the same time. Okay, let's talk competitive window and key rivals. And this is where my true optimism for Williams is going to come in. And as well, I think this could get very interesting because of the new engine regulations. These teams, I think, could potentially be right around the pace. And I think Williams will get the benefit of having the Mercedes engine over these other teams. So in terms of primary teams they'll be fighting, I have listed an Aston Martin, Ferrari, and Red Bull. This is because they have the benefit of the Mercedes engine. Aston Martin with Honda, Ferrari obviously with the Ferrari engine, and Red Bull with the Red Bull/Ford power units are going to be diving into a new engine formula with a propensity and a history of not having the strongest engines in the back of their car. And so I think if Williams is going to perform up to what I expect them to, they could realistically be fighting these teams or upwards, potentially into the top 4 of the constructors when it's all said and done. So it's gonna get interesting, to say the least. I think this is the point where I'm starting to look at all of these teams in this new era of regulations and just really looking at it going, we really just don't know, and we're not going to find out until we get on track for the first time. So I'm just giving my best guess. So we'll see what happens at the end of the day. In terms of their realistic competitive tier, I have them as a solid upper midfield team. I think they'll continue to fight in and around where they finished in 2025. So I don't think we need to be too worried about that. And in terms of 2026 as setup or must deliver year, this is actually my first call for a must deliver year. This is my first official call. They succeeded in 2025, and now it is time for them to continue to move forward. Obviously, there's a lot of questions, at least as of right now. I think they can answer the call, and I think this is a must-deliver year for them. Not necessarily in terms of winning the title, obviously, but in terms of continuing to move back to where they found themselves in like the 90s, where they were one of, if not the best team on the grid. I think they have dreams and aspirations of returning there, and at least as of right now, they are on an upward trajectory. And so I think this is a must-deliver year to continue to show that they're able to continue making steps forward. But what do you think? All right, let's get down to big picture items. Let's talk season expectations and predictions. In terms of best case scenario for the season for Williams, I think the best case scenario would be that they continue to carry the momentum from 2025. They bring a good car with good engine and good drivers to drive that car, and they continue to, at minimum, I guess you can call it stagnate in P5, really battling for the bottom half of the top of Formula One, or cementing themselves as best of the rest territory as they continue to try and move forward. So in terms of best case scenario, I think it would be them potentially fighting a team like, call it Ferrari, who may not get the same benefits in terms of engine that Williams is going to. And if Ferrari kind of flounder like we saw in 2025, I think it could get very, very fun to watch them fight it out on track. So I think in terms of best case scenario, that's probably realistically where I would see them most if everything went right. Unfortunately, for worst case scenario, I think they kind of, like what I was talking about, where they fail to capitalize on the momentum and the drivers can continue to deliver inconsistent results. This is going to be not necessarily a they fall off the cliff type of worst case scenario, but I think this is just they don't get it quite right, and it really hinders them in the momentum they've gained, and then they have to try even harder and deliver even more in the future to try and get back to where they realistically could have been. So this is definitely not in no way saying they're going to finish 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th in the constructors, but I think this is definitely a case of you look up at the end of the year, they finish 6th or 7th in the constructors, but it just really feels like a disappointing year more than anything. In terms of most likely outcome to me, I think they do use the Mercedes engine to their advantage to outperform the expectations early, and then they're able to sort of build the momentum as it goes. I think this is definitely the most likely case now, after all of these rumors that we're hearing, that the Mercedes engine should, if of course all of this is speculation as well, if the Mercedes engine is as good as we're expecting it to be, I think that can help and propel a team like Williams to overcome a bit of shortcomings that they might have in terms of the aero or car development side as a foundation. And then as they're able to get a grasp on the car and then develop forward, they'll then be able to take advantage on both sides. So I think that's probably a more likely outcome. We might see a few struggles early, but them not necessarily underperforming, and then they'll continue to move forward from there. And then finally, expected constructors finishing range. I realistically do expect Williams to finish somewhere between 4th and 6th. Is this my Williams hopium coming through once again? Maybe, but at the same time, if they're able to capitalize on this momentum with James Vowles and Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz, I think we could see Williams continue to try and move forward, especially with this major engine and regulations shakeup. So we'll see. And then finally, our one storyline to watch for Williams over 2026. And my single narrative that I'm going to be following is centered around James Vowles. Primarily because he's obviously been able to step in and raise Williams' floor as a team and expectations as a team to new heights that we hadn't necessarily seen for a few years before he arrived. Will he be able to continue to do so, especially having to navigate a entire new regulation set and continue to try and fight upwards in the constructors' ranks? That is definitely something I'm going to be following. That is very broad, but at the same time, I think it is probably the most important thing for Williams this season. And in terms of driver technical or organizational focus, I actually have a bit of a combo of driver and organizational. I think Williams needs to learn how to get back to the constructors title winning ways, as well as the drivers now need to step forward and understand that they are being given the car to do so and to take advantage. So there it is, guys. My Williams predictions for the season and preview is right there. What do you make of my Williams preview? I think Williams is the most curious team out of all 11 of where they're going to end up, primarily because I think they really succeeded in 2025, and there are just so many question marks going into 2026. So I'd love to hear your comments down below. All right, let's go ahead and keep the ball rolling. Now talking about Ferrari, the Scuderia, with a bit of an underwhelming 2025 to say the least. They did end up finishing 4th in the constructors after going into the season where a lot of us, and me included, thought that they would truly be contending for the world championship. Alas, it did not go that way. Even with the fantastic signing of Lewis Hamilton, the elite talent of Charles Leclerc, they, for whatever reason, decided to completely redo the foundation of their car, and I think it made them much, much worse off for it. Like I said, they did end up finishing 4th in the constructors, and in terms of overall team direction, they are always, for some reason or another, a contender, but I think after last season, I think I called them a contender slash midfield, because there were a lot of weekends last season where even a team like Williams was consistently overperforming them. And so if I'm calling Williams a midfield team, I think it would be doing a disservice to Williams to not at least mention the fact that Ferrari right now seem a little lost in their ways. But we're going to talk about it. And without further ado, let's go ahead, jump on into this Ferrari preview and get started with the driver lineup. Ferrari may have one of the stronger driver lineups on the entire grid, with Charles Leclerc, who has been a consistent force on the grid for a bit of an underwhelming team, as well as being paired with a 7-time world champion in Lewis Hamilton, who's coming off of his first season in Ferrari as a driver. And I think it's pretty safe to say that he's probably looking forward to a bit of a new change of pace with the 2026 regulations and another opportunity for Ferrari to deliver him a car that can maybe win him an 8th world championship. Will that be the year this year? Time will tell. But as we do know, and all we can talk about now is in terms of driver pairing, I don't know if you can have a much more experienced lineup than this. Charles Leclerc has been in the Ferrari Driver Academy for basically forever and has been the golden boy of Ferrari for as long as he's been in the team. And so he's pretty well embedded in the team. And I don't know if you can get much more experienced than a 7-time world champion, both with McLaren and Mercedes, including a dominant run at Mercedes. So in terms of driver pairing, Ferrari have everything they could have possibly asked for. Someone as loyal to the end of the earth and someone with enough technical and experiential knowledge as Lewis Hamilton. So it'll be fun to see if Ferrari can take advantage of those two things. It did not seem to go their way in 2025, but with 2026, they get another opportunity. In terms of number one versus number two drivers, I think without necessarily saying it out loud, I think Charles is the number one driver. Following a season last year where Charles was at least a little bit more consistent than Lewis. But obviously, you can't discount Lewis Hamilton either. And so I'm sure this is one of those where Ferrari would never say it, but I think Charles is number one in their eyes. But obviously, you can never dissuade a seven-time World Drivers' Champion from taking charge, and maybe he should, if we're all being entirely honest. In terms of internal dynamics or pressure points, I think Ferrari's continued disappointments year over year are definitely feeling like they're starting to build a little bit. I think last year was a bit of a culmination point of the entire sort of failures of the ground effects era for them. They obviously started the 2022 season extremely strong before fading late, and then from then on, it really didn't seem like they were able to get their feet under themselves. They did have a lot of promise at the end of 2024 where they were consistently starting to win races, starting to show a lot of pace. But then, like I said at the top, then they decided in 2025 to show up to the first weekend and go, you know what? We were winning races, we were looking really good, but what if we changed the entire dynamic and foundation of the car to something completely different, and it just doesn't work for the entire season, and you leave having all your fans ask the question of why? So, pretty big pressure point, I'd say. And then in terms of who is expected to lead development, I think this is definitely a team effort. Obviously, Ferrari are going to do what Ferrari are going to do, but I think Charles and Lewis both obviously have the experience and knowledge to help develop the car over the course of 2026. All right, let's talk biggest question going into 2026 for Ferrari, and I think it's the one on all of our minds is, will they be able to bounce back from an extremely underwhelming and disappointing 2025 season? I talked about it a lot in the last section, but it really is, I think, the biggest question on everyone's minds, which is, this is Ferrari, this is a team that touts itself as one of the most historic, most important teams on the grid, but at the same time, they consistently under-deliver year over year. And it just did not seem to be more of a microcosm of Ferrari than it was last year, where they came into the season fully convinced that they were going to be world changers. They were going to completely change the dynamic and the foundation and the philosophy of the car. And it just didn't work. And the only times they really overperformed where they were at was when they put on the 2024 components just to test and see how it went. And that's when they started to perform better. And so will they be able to bounce back? That is, I think, the biggest question here. I'm not even saying bounce back to winning titles. I'm just saying bounce back to not consistently being a disappointment at the end of every race weekend. But for that, what must go right for success? I think the biggest thing going into the season, especially for Ferrari, is their power unit. I think that obviously is a big piece for most of the teams, but Ferrari being a developer of their own power unit, very similar to Mercedes, who are going to be the direct, power unit provider supplier team for teams like Cadillac and Haas and themselves. They get the benefit of being able to work directly with the engine and the power unit to try and develop the car around it as the engine is also being developed. They must take advantage of that, and even if it doesn't live up to the same output performance of the Mercedes engine, I think they must get that right, as well as Hamilton, applying his external experiences, find those experiences and knowledge being able to be transferred to Ferrari, really starting to rear its head. I think 2025 and the immediate success for Lewis was, looking back on it, maybe a little underestimated or overestimated how much of that experience would show up, especially with the last year of regulation. I think this is the year where you're going to hopefully see a little bit of that experience and the knowledge transfer start to really rear its head. So in terms of what must go right, I think the engine needs to be just as good as it possibly can be. And we start to see some of these incremental changes that someone like Lewis Hamilton can bring to the team to try and get them out of their own way. Now, when it comes to the biggest fault, I think it is exactly a lot of the stuff tangentially to what we just talked about. The primary risk entering the season is that they are, in fact, Ferrari. They are Ferrari. They are stubborn, pretty much likely to a fault. It has been talked about year over year where they're going to do it the Ferrari way. They know what they're doing. They know how to build race cars. but the performances and the results that they're getting out of it clearly show that that isn't always necessarily the case. I think this is a really coming up to maybe a linchpin moment for Ferrari as a race team, where they really start need to look at themselves a little bit closer and start to make these sorts of incremental changes. Otherwise, they'll just continue to churn drivers, churn team principals, and continue to be a contender for race wins, but never truly contend for a world championship. And so in terms of biggest concern, I think Ferrari's stubbornness might actually be their biggest concern going into 2026. And in terms of most likely failure point, it goes exactly hand in hand. Organizational stagnation is what I have written down. In just that Ferrari just continuing to refuse to accept the fact that sometimes things need to change and that they are capable of fault. Now, it's not all doom or gloom for Ferrari, because they also have their key, their biggest upside, their key strengths or advantage. And for as much as their biggest concern being that they are Ferrari, the biggest upside is also that they are Ferrari. They have potentially some of the best marketability on any team. They have as many resources as you could possibly ask for. Ferrari basically, I believe, is effectively in a religion in Italy. And so they have all the resources necessary to succeed if they want. And they have two proven drivers over history that showed that given the tools to succeed, they can succeed. You don't get 7 world championships without being able to take advantage of good machinery. You don't have the pace of Charles Leclerc being able to be shown in a qualifying session without having the machinery to do so. If Ferrari can utilize their resources to their own advantage, they can provide good upside. I mean, I'm not sure, maybe potentially other than like Red Bull or Mercedes, who have potentially like the budget to compete with them. It's just they have the resources available to them. Can they put those pieces in the right spot? That is why that's the biggest question. But it's hard to say that that's also not one of their biggest advantages as well. And then in terms of best case performance ceiling, I think realistically, this year I could see an upper points finishing position fighting for podiums as being probably their upper limits. Obviously, they can't prove me wrong, but hearing what we have so far about the 2026 Ferrari, I think that's probably best case scenario, which honestly, after the 2025 campaign they had, I think they would take that. All right, let's talk competitive window and key rivals. I think the primary teams that Ferrari will be fighting this year will be a very similar group of teams in your Red Bulls, your McLarens, and I'm actually throwing Williams in here as well. If Williams can take the step forward that I think they can, I think Williams will insert themselves here, but I think that also has to do with sort of where Ferrari is positioned, at least right now, in the zeitgeist of Formula One. And so I think that's pretty relatively where you are, being able to fight forward, but also having weekends where you're fighting downward as well. Feels pretty realistic, to say the least. And speaking of realistic competitive tier, I think Ferrari will find themselves probably more likely in the bottom of the upper tier in Formula One. It's kind of basically exactly where they were last year. I think they'll have higher highs, more consistent highs, but considering the teams that will have the Mercedes engine with them, I think they'll give them a lot of trouble at the same time. And obviously Ferrari is Ferrari, so we'll leave it at that. And then is 2026 a setup year or a must-deliver year? I actually am going to deviate a little bit from what I've been saying, in that they just need to get back to where they were. I'm dubbing this a must-deliver year for Ferrari, mainly because they signed Lewis Hamilton to fight for championships again and being given the opportunity to do so. And I don't think they can get away with underachieving again. I think it's one story, it'll kind of go into this later in our storylines to watch for the season, but I do think this is a bit of a must deliver year. Not necessarily a must deliver a championship, but this is a must deliver a good season with good results. All right, let's talk season expectations and a little bit of predictions. Let's talk best case scenario for Ferrari. And I think the best case scenario is that they bounce back from a poor 2025 and get back to challenging for podiums consistently and potentially taking advantage of wins here and there given the right circumstances as well. I think this is a pretty solid result for Ferrari if this were to come true. I think it's right where they've kind of positioned themselves over the entire ground effects era of regulations, and I think this is a place they would enjoy getting back to this year in the first year of a new set of regulations. Unfortunately, worst case scenarios also exist, and I think if the worst case scenario of their engine sort of failing to compete at the level necessary, and that they don't bring a package that lives up to their expectations, I think things could start to spiral a little bit, and they could find themselves potentially being more of a midfield team than a true contender tier there in the upper half of the upper portion of the grid. So in terms of worst case scenario, I think finding themselves mired down in the midfield would be about as worst case scenario as a Ferrari fan could tolerate. But that said, the most likely outcome, I think we'll possibly see them struggle to challenge for podiums consistently, but they will consistently finish inside the points, probably in pretty decent positions, and then being able to take advantage of strong tracks for their package and probably put some podiums together, hopefully. If not, I think it will be a lot of questions raised. So it'll be a very up and down year for Ferrari, I think is kind of where we're getting at. But even then, an up and down year for Ferrari still gives them an expected constructors finishing range for me between third and fifth, probably kind of exactly where they were. Not necessarily really challenging for the title, but definitely sort of in the mix depending on weekend to weekend results there in the third to fifth range. And then, all right, finally, our one storyline to watch. I sort of teased it before, but the single narrative that I'm going to be following during this season is, will Ferrari do enough to keep both Lewis Hamilton in the sport and Charles Leclerc committed to their team? I think there has been a lot of talk, especially over 2025, about Charles Leclerc and potentially needing to make a move if he wants to win a world championship. It has been a thing where Ferrari has consistently under-delivered cars for him. And I think at the end of the day, while he does obviously bleed Scuderia Red to his soul, I think he will value an opportunity for a world championship at another team should it really come down to it. And obviously Lewis making the move to Ferrari after being such a successful stint at Mercedes, obviously probably one of the most successful stints a driver can have with a single team. He wanted to make a change, not only because he wanted to drive for Ferrari, but also because I think he and everyone else knows that his time in Formula One is more than likely coming to an end, not in the probably not too distant future. And this could be a make or break sort of storyline to follow with Ferrari, where if they continue just to under deliver the machinery that he's looking for, it could accelerate that. It could do a lot of things. So that is definitely what I'm going to be following in 2026. And then lastly, driver, technical, or organizational focus. I went technical and organization. I think the technical side is pretty obvious. Ferrari needs to develop a car that can deliver, as well as the organizational side where they cannot continue to underperform on the organizational side as well, because they have obviously had some pretty documented cases of failures on that side as well. So it'll be interesting to see, to say the least, but Ferrari is definitely going to be one of the teams to watch in 2026. All right, let's round this thing out. Red Bull, our final team here in this video for team previews, who finished third last year off the back of Max Verstappen, and Max Verstappen effectively alone. It was a very exciting year for Red Bull, who had a bit of shakeup there at the top, as well as some interesting things to follow in terms of the driver side as well. Obviously, Max Verstappen, the one constant there. They started the year off with Liam Lawson, finished the year with Yuki Tsunoda, as we talked about with the V-carb transition in the preview that we had a couple of weeks ago. It was a fun year for Red Bull. I think they got to truly see what they had in terms of drivers up and down their driver lineup, ultimately settling in for 2026. Like I said, they finished third last year. And as always, Red Bull is a contender in Formula One. I think you would be hard-pressed to find Red Bull not truly be a contender at this point in time. Let's kick things off with driver lineup and dynamics. We kind of already touched on it a little bit. The 2026 Red Bull lineup will be Max Verstappen and Isaac Hadjar, who recently got the promotion up from V-carb last season after his rookie campaign, and now begins his sophomore campaign in the main team. And in terms of experience versus youth balance, this is extreme balance, because you have Max Verstappen, a four-time world champion, and a sophomore teammate in Isaac Hadjar, who spent his first season in the V-carb, RB, Racing Bulls, whatever you want to call them, from 2025. Obviously, Hadjar had a very successful 2025, scoring himself a podium and really performing very, very well over the course of the season. Red Bull ultimately deciding to make the call to move him up into the main team with Yuki Tsunoda's departure from Formula One as of right now. So it will be fun to watch his progression over the course of the season, especially going into a new era of regulations, and see how he stacks up against Max Verstappen. The question of clear number one or number two, I don't know if there has been a clearer example of a definitive number one versus number two driver. The number one driver, obviously, implicitly being Max Verstappen, with Isaac Hadjar taking the number two spot. I don't think he or anyone else would have expected anything else. You will never convince me otherwise of that. And in terms of internal dynamics or pressure points between the drivers, I think this is just another example of a year where will the Red Bull second seat live up to the first seat? I think there has been a lot of speculation over the last handful of years about how the curse of the second Red Bull seat, ending careers and just truly not living up to the Max Verstappen standard that Red Bull has developed over the course of his stint in the team. And so it is going to be on Isaac Hadjar to do that. But in terms of dynamics or pressure points, I think that is definitely always going to be the case when it comes to the Red Bull second seat. So we'll keep an eye on that. And then obviously, who is expected to lead development? And the only answer I'm going to give to that is, do I even have to ask? Let's go ahead and move on now to biggest questions heading into 2026. And I think the biggest one that I have is, in terms of their biggest unknown for Red Bull, is will their power unit stand up enough to compete against the Mercedes engine? We've seen in years past, especially last year, probably the best example, that Max Verstappen is able to compete at the top end of the grid, given even a package that may not necessarily deserve to be there. This one going into 2026 and this, what we assume this new era of regulations is going to be like, the biggest question that I have is, will the new Red Bull power unit give Max Verstappen the tools to continue that trend? Obviously, he's going to get the most out of that car one way or another, but will it be fighting for wins, fighting for podiums, or fighting for points? Time will tell, and that is definitely the biggest unknown that I have for Red Bull going into 2026. And in terms of what must go right, I think that the shared trick that Red Bull seemed to have worked out alongside Mercedes in terms of the engine compression ratios and things like that, I think that needs to go right. Obviously, the two interpretations might be slightly different between Red Bull and Mercedes. And so in terms of what must go right for them to have success, I think it needs to be, one, a reliability thing through and through. And then as well, the trick that they developed alongside Mercedes also gives them a bit of a leg up on the rest of the competition. Now, that said, in terms of biggest concerns, I think we start and finish the last section with the beginning of this section, with the primary risk also being going into a new engine formula with a new power unit from a brand new power unit supplier. Yeah, it's got big risks all over the place. They obviously have developed a very similar trick that Mercedes did that's supposed to give them a little bit of that engine performance advantage. But at the same time, you also run the risk on the counter side of Mercedes has been making these engines for Formula One for a very long time and had a lot of success with it. And Red Bull is making a new power unit from the ground up and is going to have to run that. And so in terms of, it's very much a risk reward setup, as if they're going to get a lot of upside, they might also have to run with a lot of the downside and risks as well. And then in terms of, it goes right along with it, most likely a failure point if things go wrong. I think the power unit is 100% the thing. It's power unit, all up and down. Not only the grid, but especially within Red Bull itself. And so they're going to take the wins where they get them, but there might be a little bit of a betting in point as well before Max really gets going. Now, the biggest upside for the team is, I'm sure, an upside that any team would kill to have, including Mercedes at the end of the day, is that their key strength or advantage is that Max Verstappen still drives for Red Bull Racing. He's shown however many times over, and maybe none more so than last year, that he will always be there and he will always get the maximum out of the car and even rise above the performance of the car to overperform expectations. And so in terms of a key strength or advantage, Max Verstappen can cover up a lot of issues, and he has shown consistently that just by driving for Red Bull will always find themselves finishing well up the grid, at least with one car. And then in terms of best case performance ceiling, I think the best case scenario for Red Bull would be podium consistency with wins here or there. I think it'll be a very similar thing to what we saw in 2025 from Max Verstappen. The more realistic question in terms of performance ceiling might be for the second Red Bull driver seat. I think this actually is an opportunity for the second seat to really get a good leg up at least not necessarily competing with Max, but at least against him. In that it'll be a new regulation across the board. They don't have to jump in with Max already having driven the ground effects cars for a couple of years and getting really on top of it and had time to develop it around it, et cetera, et cetera. Isaac gets to jump in with a brand new regulation, same as Max, and gets to try and fight for his spot in Formula One and in Red Bull. So in terms of best case performance ceiling, I think in terms of as a true team, I think consistent point scoring from both drivers is about their performance ceiling. Maybe not necessarily double podiums, but definitely double points finishes. All right, let's go ahead and talk competitive window and key rivals for Red Bull Racing. Let's start with the primary teams that they'll be fighting this year. And I think it's pretty standard McLaren, Ferrari, and I even threw Mercedes in here just because it's, probably not realistic that Mercedes is going to dominate in every which weekend. And so it's not like they're going to exist in a tier of their own. I think this will be primarily the 4 teams fighting for the top 4 spots in the constructors once again. And I think it'll be pretty consistent weekend to weekend, depending on, who comes and brings their A+ game compared to the others. But these primarily will be the teams that they're fighting with, unlike, not too different from what we've seen in years past. And then, realistic competitive tier, strong front end team with high highs and probably not too low lows. I mean, it's notable news when Max Verstappen basically finishes out of like the top 8. And so, let alone finishing out of the points. So, I think this will be a relatively high floor, probably, high floor, lowish ceiling, but obviously Max Verstappen raises that ceiling still pretty high. And then in terms of 2026 being a setup year versus a must deliver year, I think this is definitely a setup year. I think 2027 is when we'll get back to a true must deliver year for Red Bull. Obviously, integrating with a new power unit will cause some headaches. But I don't think Red Bull would ever admit that they're not going into a season not expecting to win the World Championship. And let's talk season expectations and a little bit of predictions. Best case scenario for Red Bull Racing in 2026. Max Verstappen gets the maximum out of an okay car and continues to prove that he's one of the best drivers on the planet. And Red Bull fights towards the front on most weekends. And then with Isaac Hadjar's side, I think best case scenario would be sort of the position of just always consistently finishing in the points, being there and thereabouts to assist with Max in terms of on-track fights. There was plenty of times in seasons past where the second driver hasn't necessarily been there to provide a Sergio Perez-esque assistance to Max. Should he need it, Max was sort of doing it all on his own. And so in terms of best case scenario, I don't think it'll be a case of both Red Bulls fighting for the same position on track, but I think at a minimum we'll have a Red Bull sort of there or thereabouts in the points consistently. I think is a pretty solid best case scenario for Red Bull in 2026. On the flip side, worst case scenario is that the new power unit, I think, has a lot of reliability issues, causing huge inconsistencies for both drivers all season long. If it really truly is a case of a power unit struggling that much, it can definitely cause both a lot of confidence in the car issues, which then lead to other further issues from there, as well as just some confidence issues maybe internally as well about whether or not they can deliver the results weekend to weekend and truly fight for a championship. So worst case scenario, I think that's probably the biggest pressure point when it comes to worst case scenario for the season expectations. Now, in terms of most likely outcome, I think Max will do what he does, consistently overperform the car, and then I think Isaac will actually be the one showing the inconsistencies and the limitations of the new Red Bull platform. I still expect Max to finish inside the top 4 in the championship, but I think we'll see the limitations rear their heads through Isaac Hadjar, but I still do think we'll see Isaac be able to deliver more consistent results than second drivers past. And then for expected constructors finish range, I have 2nd through 4th listed here because I don't know if I see enough or have heard enough from Red Bull to predict them to potentially win the constructors. But I do think they'll be there or thereabouts. If they're not challenging for the win, at minimum, they're still well within the top 4. And then let's close a Red Bull out with our one storyline to watch this season. And the single biggest narrative that I'm going to follow this season actually has to do with Isaac Hadjar and whether or not he can be the one to sort of close the gap between Max and the second Red Bull seat. I think this is an opportunity to really see the level of driver being prepared by Red Bull for that Red Bull team. In the first season of a new era of regulations, these drivers obviously Isaac only has 1 year under his belt, and it was with the ground effects cars, and so this is going to be a good litmus test for the Red Bull Driver Academy, really, to see whether or not was it the ground effects cars being developed specifically for Max, or is it truly just a preparation problem with Red Bull? It'll be very interesting. And then in terms of Max, I think it'll be interesting to follow to see if he can continue his streak of always being in contention for a championship, even with a car that may not necessarily deserve to be fighting at that point. I think it's fascinating to watch, and I can't wait to see what he does there in terms of fighting for the title, or just finishing as high up in the grid as possible compared to the car underneath him. And then finally, driver technical or organizational focus. I think it's always going to be drivers with Red Bull, because Max Verstappen exists, and the second Red Bull seat is as fascinating as they come. There we have it, guys. Our final preview with 3 teams is down. I think Williams, Ferrari, and Red Bull present the probably most interesting 3 teams to cover in a row, because I think you have the very wide variety of styles. You have the true unknown in Williams, and will they be able to perform? You have the Ferrari of, will they be able to perform, but slightly higher up, and then Red Bull knowing they're going to perform, but it might only be for one car or maybe both. It's a fascinating trio of teams to cover, to say the least. I had a lot of fun prepping for this video. Where do you think these teams are going to finish? I would be so interested to know where you guys think it's going. These 3 teams will wrap up. Like I said, it's such an interesting trio of teams to predict. But let me know down in the comment section below, and get excited, because next week we'll have our final team preview covering both McLaren and Mercedes as we round out our run through the grid on our way towards the 2026 season. If you've made it this far into the video, I really appreciate you, and leave a like rating on the video because it really helps me out. And as always, if you haven't already, subscribe down below. We'd love to have you join our small but growing community as we grow and continue to prepare for the 2026 season, which is creeping ever closer. I appreciate you watching this video. Stay on the lookout for the final team preview next week. But I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.